He thought the answers lay hidden in the brittle pages of a forgotten journal. But when he walked into the archive room, everything changed. Who was he, really? And why did his presence feel like a truth she had always known, yet never read? Don't miss this gripping tale of secrets, legacy, and the kind of truth that doesn't need to be written to be felt. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The autumn rain fell in steady sheets across Boston's cobblestone streets, turning the gaslit avenues into rivers of amber light and shadow. It was October of 1897, and the city wore its evening cloak with elegant melancholy. Inside the grand reading room of the Massachusetts Historical Society, Miss Eleanor Ashford sat at a mahogany table surrounded by leather-bound journals and yellowed documents that smelled of time itself. Eleanor was 26 years old, with chestnut hair pinned in the Gibson girl style that had become fashionable, and hazel eyes that seemed to catch and hold the lamplight. She wore a tailored navy walking suit with leg-of-mutton sleeves, the height of propriety for a young woman of her station. Her father, the late Professor Richard Ashford, had been a renowned historian, and she had inherited not only his intellect, but also his passion for uncovering the truth hidden in forgotten papers. For 3 months, Eleanor had been researching her father's final, unfinished work about a mysterious benefactor who had funded several orphanages throughout New England in the 1840s. The benefactor's identity had remained anonymous, signing all correspondence simply as a friend to the friendless. Her father had believed this person's story held significance beyond mere philanthropy, something deeper that connected to one of Boston's founding families, but he had died of pneumonia before completing his investigation. Eleanor carefully turned the brittle pages of a journal dated 1843, her gloved fingers moving with practiced delicacy. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, as though the writer had been racing against time itself. She had been reading for hours, her tea grown cold beside her, when footsteps echoed across the polished floor behind her. "I apologize for the interruption, Miss Ashford, but we close in 30 minutes, came a man's voice, cultured and warm, with an undertone of something she could not quite identify. Eleanor looked up and found herself meeting the gaze of a man she had never seen before in the reading room. He was tall, perhaps 30 years of age, with dark hair and striking blue eyes that seemed to assess everything with quiet intelligence. He wore a well-tailored charcoal suit that spoke of understated wealth, and he carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, yet not burdened by arrogance. "Oh, forgive me," Eleanor said, glancing at the brass clock on the wall. "I lose track of time when I am absorbed in research. Are you one of the new archivists?" A slight smile touched his lips. "Not exactly. I am Theodore Blackwell. I have recently been granted access to the Society's collections for my own research. I noticed you have been coming here regularly these past weeks, always requesting documents related to charitable institutions from the 1840s. Forgive my curiosity, but such dedication is rare." Eleanor felt a flutter of surprise mixed with caution. In her experience, men who took notice of her work often dismissed it as a charming hobby rather than serious scholarship. Yet something in Theodore Blackwell's tone suggested genuine interest rather than condescension. "I am continuing my father's research," she explained, closing the journal carefully. "He believed there was an important story hidden in these records, one that has been overlooked by history." Theodore moved closer, and Eleanor noticed he walked with a slight favor of his left leg, barely perceptible but present nonetheless. He gestured toward the chair across from her. "May I?" She hesitated only a moment before nodding. There was something about him that felt trustworthy, though she could not explain why. Perhaps it was the directness of his gaze, or the respectful distance he maintained. "Your father was Professor Ashford," Theodore said, settling into the chair. "I read his work on colonial maritime law. His scholarship was impeccable. I was saddened to hear of his passing last year." "You knew of him?" Eleanor asked, surprised and touched. "I did. In fact, I have been searching for something connected to his final research, though I did not know his daughter had taken up the investigation." Theodore paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Miss Ashford, what I am about to tell you may sound extraordinary, but I ask that you hear me out completely." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. "Go on. 6 months ago, I inherited my grandfather's estate in Beacon Hill. Among his effects, I found a sealed letter addressed to whoever inherited after him. The letter was written by my great-grandfather, Marcus Blackwell, and in it he confessed to a secret he had kept his entire life. He was the anonymous benefactor your father was researching. The words hung in the air between them like a revelation suspended in time. Eleanor stared at Theodore, her mind racing through implications and questions. But why the secrecy? Why hide such charitable work? That is what I have been trying to discover, Theodore said, leaning forward slightly. The letter mentioned a journal, one that contained the full truth of his motivations and actions. He wrote that he had hidden it somewhere safe, where only someone who truly understood the importance of mercy and justice would find it, but he left no clear indication of where. Eleanor's thoughts immediately flew to the journal she had just been reading. What year did your great-grandfather die? 1868. He was 73 years old. She pulled the journal back toward her, opening it to the inside cover where she had noted the dates. This journal spans 1843 to 1845. It belonged to someone who managed one of the orphanages in Salem. There are frequent references to receiving funds from an unnamed benefactor who would visit at night, always leaving before anyone could see his face clearly. Theodore's eyes lit with interest. May I see it? Eleanor slid the journal across the table, watching as he examined the pages with the same careful attention she had given them. His hands were steady and sure, the hands of someone who respected the fragility of historical documents. As he read, she found herself studying his profile, the concentration evident in the slight furrow of his brow, the way lamplight caught in his dark hair. This matches the timeline, Theodore murmured. And look here, this passage about the benefactor having a distinctive walking stick with a silver handle shaped like an owl. My great-grandfather had such a stick. It is still in the estate, mounted in the study. Eleanor felt excitement building in her chest, the same thrill she always experienced when pieces of a historical puzzle began to fit together. Mr. Blackwell, I believe our research interests are more than coincidentally aligned. Perhaps we should consider working together. He looked up from the journal, and their eyes met with an intensity that made Eleanor's breath catch slightly. There was something in that moment, a connection that went beyond mere scholarly collaboration, though neither would have named it as such. I would be honored, Miss Ashford, Theodore said quietly. Though I must warn you, there are aspects of this mystery that may prove uncomfortable. My great-grandfather's letter hinted that his charitable work was connected to a wrong he witnessed, something involving one of Boston's most prominent families. He wrote that the truth, if revealed, could still cause scandal, even now. My father always said that history's purpose is not to preserve comfort, but to preserve truth, Eleanor replied firmly. Whatever we discover, it deserves to be known. Theodore smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his serious features into something warmer. Then we are of like mind. There is a passage in the letter that has puzzled me. It says, "The key to understanding lies not in my words, but in my actions," recorded faithfully by she who saw with clear eyes and a compassionate heart. I believe he was referring to someone who kept records, perhaps at one of the institutions he supported. Eleanor's mind was already working through the possibilities. The matrons of the orphanages would have kept detailed journals. If we could locate those, we might find more specific clues about where your great-grandfather hid his own journal. The society closes now, Theodore said, glancing again at the clock. But perhaps you would permit me to call on you tomorrow? We could discuss our findings and plan our next steps. I have access to my great-grandfather's papers at the estate, and you clearly have expertise in navigating these archives. It was forward, Eleanor knew, for a man she had just met to propose a private meeting. But the investigation mattered more than convention, and something in her trusted Theodore Blackwell. Perhaps it was the earnestness in his eyes, or the way he had spoken of her father with genuine respect, or simply an instinct she had learned to trust over her years of research. You may call at 2 o'clock, she said, writing her address on a slip of paper. My aunt serves as my chaperone. She will appreciate a visitor who can discuss something other than the weather and society gossip. Theodore took the paper carefully, as though it were as valuable as the ancient documents surrounding them. Until tomorrow then, Miss Ashford. I look forward to continuing this conversation. He stood, and Eleanor noticed again that slight hesitation in his movement. Before she could think better of it, she asked, Your leg, if you do not mind my asking, was it injured? Most men would have bristled at such a personal question, but Theodore simply nodded. A riding accident 3 years ago. A horse spooked during a storm. Threw me badly. The doctor said I was fortunate it was not worse. I still ride, though more cautiously now. Caution born of experience is wisdom, not weakness, Eleanor said gently. Something shifted in Theodore's expression, a softening around his eyes. You are a rare person, Miss Ashford. Most people either pretend not to notice or offer excessive sympathy. You simply acknowledge it as a fact and move forward. Should I do otherwise? She asked, beginning to gather her materials. No, he said quietly. It is perfect as it is. They parted at the entrance of the society, Theodore holding an umbrella over Eleanor as he helped her into a waiting hansom cab. The rain had lessened to a gentle drizzle, and the streets gleamed like black mirrors reflecting the gas lamps. As the cab pulled away, Eleanor looked back through the small rear window and saw Theodore still standing there, watching until she disappeared around the corner. That night, in her bedroom in the elegant brownstone she shared with her Aunt Margaret, Eleanor sat at her writing desk and reviewed her notes by candlelight. But her thoughts kept drifting from the historical mystery to the man who had entered her life so unexpectedly. Theodore Blackwell seemed to carry secrets of his own, not just those inherited from his great-grandfather. There was a depth to him, a quiet intensity that suggested a man who had known loss and learned to live with it. She thought of how his eyes had lit when discussing the research, how carefully he had handled the old journal, how respectfully he had spoken to her as an intellectual equal rather than a woman to be humored. In her experience, such men were extraordinarily rare. The rain picked up again, pattering against the window panes, and somewhere in the night a church bell tolled 11 times. Eleanor extinguished her candle and lay in bed, listening to the storm and thinking about keys hidden in old journals and truths waiting to be discovered. But mostly, she thought about tomorrow at 2 o'clock and the curious feeling of anticipation that had taken root in her heart. Theodore Blackwell arrived at precisely 2 o'clock the following afternoon, carrying a leather satchel that Eleanor suspected contained documents from his great-grandfather's estate. The rain had cleared overnight, leaving Boston washed clean and bright under an autumn sun that turned the wet streets into ribbons of gold. Eleanor's Aunt Margaret, a spirited woman of 50 with silver-streaked hair and keen gray eyes, received him in the parlor with the practiced grace of someone who had navigated Boston society for decades. "Mr. Blackwell, how delightful," Aunt Margaret said, gesturing to the settee upholstered in burgundy velvet. "Eleanor has spoken of little else since last evening. I confess it has been refreshing to see her so animated about something beyond dusty archives." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Aunt Margaret, please. Mr. Blackwell will think me obsessive." "On the contrary," Theodore said, settling into his seat with that slight care Eleanor now recognized. "Passion for one's work is admirable. The world has too many people who drift through life without purpose." Aunt Margaret poured tea from a porcelain service painted with delicate roses, studying Theodore with the shrewd assessment of a woman who had seen countless young men come and go. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her, for she smiled warmly. "I shall leave you two to your research, though I will be in the adjoining room with my embroidery should you need anything. Propriety must be observed after all." Once they were settled with tea and small cakes, Theodore opened his satchel and withdrew several documents, spreading them carefully on the mahogany table between them. "I spent half the night reading through my great-grandfather's papers. What I discovered raises more questions than it answers." Eleanor leaned forward, her curiosity fully engaged. "What did you find?" "Letters," Theodore said, sliding a bundle tied with faded ribbon toward her. "Correspondence between Marcus Blackwell and a woman named Catherine Whitmore. She was the head matron at the Salem orphanage from 1842 to 1849. Their letters speak of the children, of course, but there is something else beneath the surface. A shared understanding of some tragedy they both witnessed." Eleanor untied the ribbon with careful fingers, aware of Theodore watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken slightly. The first letter was dated March 1843, written in a feminine hand that was both elegant and practical. "Dear Mr. Blackwell," Eleanor read aloud, "I received your generous donation with profound gratitude. The children now have warm coats for the remainder of winter, and we have purchased additional beds for the dormitory. But I write also to tell you that I have done as you requested. I have recorded everything in my private journal, exactly as events unfolded that terrible night. Should anything happen to me, the journal will go to my sister in Providence, with instructions that it be preserved. You need not fear that the truth will be lost." Some things must be remembered, no matter how painful the remembering. Theodore nodded gravely. Every letter references this journal and this mysterious night. My great-grandfather's responses have not survived, but Catherine's letters make it clear that they shared a secret, something they both felt honor-bound to document but afraid to reveal publicly. What happened to Catherine Whitmore? Eleanor asked, already sensing the answer would not be happy. She died in 1849, of cholera. She was only 32 years old. Theodore paused, his expression shadowed with old sorrow for a woman neither of them had known. Her sister, Hannah Whitmore, married and became Hannah Porter. I have traced her descendants. Her great-granddaughter, Mrs. Elizabeth Porter Carmichael, still lives in Providence. She is elderly now, but I sent her a telegram this morning, explaining my interest in any family papers that might have survived. Eleanor felt excitement building once more. If Catherine's journal still exists after all these years, it could contain the answers we seek. But what of the key mentioned in your great-grandfather's letter? He wrote that it was hidden in his journal, but his journal itself is lost. Not entirely lost, Theodore said quietly. I believe I know where it might be. Last night I examined the owl-headed walking stick more closely. The owl's head unscrews, and inside the hollow handle I found this. He withdrew a small brass key from his waistcoat pocket, placing it on the table between them. It was old and tarnished, with an elaborate head carved in the shape of an open book. Eleanor picked it up, feeling the weight of it, the sense that this small object held significance beyond its size. A key shaped like a book, she murmured. For a strong box, perhaps, or a locked desk. I searched the entire estate last night, Theodore said, frustration evident in his voice. Every locked box, every cabinet, every piece of furniture with a keyhole. Nothing fits. I keep thinking I am missing something obvious, something that my great-grandfather would have considered a proper hiding place for truth. Eleanor turned the key over in her palm, studying it from every angle. The book design was detailed, with tiny lines suggesting pages and even minuscule letters etched along the spine, though they were too worn to read clearly. Perhaps the key itself is not meant to open a physical lock. Perhaps it is symbolic, a clue to where the real journal is hidden. What do you mean? Theodore asked, leaning closer. Eleanor caught the faint scent of bay rum and wool, distinctly masculine and somehow comforting. Your great-grandfather wrote that the key to understanding lies not in his words but in his actions, Eleanor said, thinking aloud, and those actions were recorded by Catherine Whitmore. What if the key, literal or metaphorical, is in her journal? What if we need to find her writings first, and they will lead us to his? Theodore's eyes widened with understanding. Of course, he would not have hidden his journal in his own home, where family might find it and be hurt by its contents. He would have hidden it somewhere connected to his charitable work, somewhere meaningful, somewhere that Catherine Whitmore would have known about, Eleanor added. They were clearly partners in this secret. If she recorded his actions faithfully, she might have also recorded where he planned to preserve his own account. A knock at the parlor door interrupted them. Aunt Margaret entered with a silver tray bearing a telegram. This just arrived for you, Mr. Blackwell. The boy said it was urgent. Theodore opened it quickly, and Eleanor watched his expression shift from anticipation to satisfaction. It is from Mrs. Carmichael in Providence. She writes that she does have her great-grandmother's journal among the family papers. She invites us to call upon her tomorrow afternoon to examine it. She says she has often wondered about its contents but never felt it was her place to read something so clearly private. Us? Eleanor asked, surprised. The telegram specifically mentions that I wrote of Professor Ashford's daughter assisting in the research. Mrs. Carmichael writes that she approves of a woman taking interest in historical scholarship and would be pleased to meet you. Theodore smiled. It seems your reputation precedes you, Miss Ashford. Aunt Margaret, who had been listening with interest, spoke up. Providence is several hours by train. You would need to leave quite early and might not return until evening. Eleanor, I should accompany you. Of course, Aunt Margaret, Eleanor said, though her heart was already racing ahead to the journey, to the promise of discovery, to spending a full day in Theodore's company. We shall make all proper arrangements. After Theodore departed with plans to meet them at the train station the following morning, Eleanor found herself restless with anticipation. She tried to focus on her correspondence, on organizing her notes, but her thoughts kept drifting to the mystery and to the man who had brought it into her life. There was something about Theodore Blackwell that drew her, beyond the intellectual connection of shared research. He treated her as an equal, yes, But there was more. She had caught him watching her several times with an expression she could not quite interpret, something warm and wondering that made her feel seen in a way she had not experienced before. That evening, as she prepared for bed, Eleanor stood at her window, looking out over the gas-lit streets of Boston. Somewhere in this city, Theodore was likely doing the same, perhaps thinking about tomorrow's journey, perhaps thinking about the secrets they would uncover, or perhaps, she allowed herself to imagine, thinking about her. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, perfect autumn weather for travel. Eleanor, dressed in a practical traveling suit of dark green wool, with a fitted jacket and a skirt that would be comfortable for sitting on trains. She pinned her hat securely and collected her notebook and pencils, determined to document everything they discovered. Theodore met them at South Station, looking distinguished in a black traveling coat and carrying a walking stick, different from his great-grandfather's owl-headed cane but clearly necessary for his comfort on long journeys. He helped both Eleanor and Aunt Margaret aboard the train with attentive courtesy, securing them a private compartment for the journey south. As the train pulled out of the station, its wheels creating that rhythmic clatter against the rails, Eleanor felt a sense of adventure she had not experienced since childhood. The Massachusetts countryside rolled past the windows, all autumn gold and russet. Forests giving way to fields and small villages clustered around white-steepled churches. Aunt Margaret dozed in her seat, lulled by the train's motion, leaving Eleanor and Theodore to speak quietly without disturbing her. Theodore had brought more of the letters, and they spent the first hour reviewing them, looking for any additional clues they might have missed. "Tell me about your father," Theodore said during a lull in their work. "What was he like beyond his scholarship?" Eleanor smiled, touched by the question. "He was kind. Brilliant, certainly, but never pompous about it. He believed that knowledge should be shared, not hoarded. He used to take me to the archives with him when I was a girl, teaching me to read old documents, to look for the stories behind the official records. He said that history was not made by kings and generals alone, but by ordinary people making extraordinary choices." "He sounds like a remarkable man," Theodore said softly. "You must miss him terribly." "Every day," Eleanor admitted, feeling the familiar ache of loss. "But continuing his work helps. It feels like keeping him alive in some way, honoring what he thought was important." Theodore was quiet for a moment, looking out at the passing landscape. When he spoke again, his voice held a weight of shared grief. "I lost my parents when I was 19. A fire at our summer house in Newport. They died trying to save the servants who were trapped on the upper floors. Everyone got out, but my parents did not." Eleanor reached across the space between them, placing her gloved hand gently over his. "Theodore, I am so sorry." He looked down at their hands, then up at her face, and Eleanor saw in his eyes a vulnerability that made her heart constrict. "It is why my great-grandfather's legacy matters so much to me. He was a man who tried to do good in secret, to help those who could not help themselves. I want to understand him, to know if I come from a line of decent people who tried to make the world better. After my parents died, I questioned everything about my family, about whether their lives had meaning. This research feels like finding an answer to that question." "They died saving others," Eleanor said firmly. "That is meaning enough. And you are here, trying to honor your great-grandfather's memory by uncovering a truth he wanted preserved. That speaks to who you are, Theodore." It was the first time she had used his given name, and she saw him notice, saw something kindle in his eyes that made her breath catch. For a moment, the train compartment seemed to shrink, the world narrowing to just the two of them and this fragile, growing thing between them that was not yet spoken, but unmistakably present. Aunt Margaret stirred, and they both withdrew slightly, returning to a more proper distance, but something had shifted. Eleanor could feel it in the air between them, in the way Theodore's gaze lingered on her face, in the warmth that spread through her chest whenever their eyes met. Providence appeared outside the windows shortly after noon, its hills crowned with church spires and brick buildings that spoke of old money and older traditions. Mrs. Elizabeth Carmichael lived on Benefit Street, in a federal-style house painted yellow with white trim and a garden that even in October showed signs of careful tending. The elderly woman who received them was tiny and bird-like, with white hair piled high and eyes that missed nothing despite her 80-some years. She greeted them in a parlor filled with family portraits and furniture that had clearly passed through generations. "Mr. Blackwell, Miss Ashford, Mrs. Abbott, welcome," she said, her voice still strong despite her age. "I confess, your telegram intrigued me greatly. I have wondered about great-grandmother Catherine's journal for years, but it seemed too private to read, too much like prying into sorrows that were not mine to know. We are grateful for your willingness to share it now," Theodore said respectfully. "Whatever we discover, we promise to treat it with the dignity it deserves." Mrs. Carmichael nodded approvingly. "I can see you are people who understand the weight of the past. Very well. The journal has been kept in our family archive, preserved in a cedar chest with other papers from that branch of the family. I shall fetch it." She returned carrying a leather-bound book, worn and darkened with age, its pages swollen slightly from decades of humidity, despite careful storage. She placed it on the table before them with a solemnity that made Eleanor realize they were about to cross a threshold, about to learn secrets that had been kept for more than 50 years. "Before you read," Mrs. Carmichael said, "I should tell you what little I know from family stories. Great-grandmother Catherine was said to have witnessed something terrible involving a child and a powerful family. She spoke of it only once on her deathbed, telling her sister Hannah that the truth was written down and must be preserved. Hannah kept the journal but never read it, passing it to her daughter with the same instructions. And so it has come down to me, unread, waiting for someone with reason to know." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she opened the journal to the first page. The ink had faded to brown, but Catherine Whitmore's handwriting was still clear, each letter formed with care. The first entry was dated January 15th, 1843. "Today I begin this account at the urging of Mr. Marcus Blackwell, who says that truth must have a witness and that witness must leave a record. What I am about to write concerns events of December 12th, 1842, a night I shall never forget as long as I draw breath. It was the night I learned that even the finest houses can hide the darkest cruelties, and that silence in the face of evil is itself a sin." Eleanor looked up, meeting Theodore's eyes. They both understood they were about to uncover something significant, something that had shaped Marcus Blackwell's entire life and driven him to decades of secret charity. She continued reading, and as the words unfolded, the story of that December night came to life across the gulf of years. Catherine Whitmore's journal revealed a story that made Eleanor's heart ache with both sorrow and admiration for the courage it must have taken to record such painful truth. As she read aloud, with Theodore and Aunt Margaret listening intently, and Mrs. Carmichael nodding as though pieces of an old family puzzle were finally fitting together, the events of that December night in 1842 unfolded like a ghost materializing from the past. Catherine had been 25 years old, newly appointed as head matron of the Salem orphanage. On the evening of December 12th, she had been working late in her office when she heard a commotion at the front door. Opening it, she found Marcus Blackwell, then a man of 47, and already successful in shipping and trade, standing in the freezing rain with a child in his arms. The child was a girl of perhaps 7 years, unconscious, her clothes torn and bloodied, her face bruised. Marcus Blackwell had been nearly incoherent with rage and grief, explaining in broken sentences that he had found the child thrown into an alley behind the Ashworth mansion on Beacon Hill, left to die in the cold after what appeared to be a brutal beating. "The Ashworth family," Theodore breathed, and Eleanor heard the recognition in his voice. The Ashworths were one of Boston's oldest and most prestigious families, their fortune built on textiles and banking, their name synonymous with social prominence and political influence. Eleanor continued reading, her voice steady despite the horror of what she was recounting. Catherine had immediately sent for a doctor, one who could be trusted with discretion. The child, once revived and treated, had been too traumatized to speak, but her injuries told a terrible story. Over the following weeks, as she slowly healed in Catherine's care, fragments of truth emerged. The girl's name was Anna. She had been a housemaid's daughter, living in the servants' quarters of the Ashworth mansion. The family's eldest son, William Ashworth, a man of 30 known for his violent temper and excessive drinking, had developed what Catherine carefully termed as an improper and wicked fixation on the child. When Anna's mother had tried to take her daughter and leave the household, William had flown into a rage. He had beaten the child savagely and ordered his personal servants to dispose of her where she would not be found. It was Marcus Blackwell, conducting business with the elder Ashworth that evening, who had heard screams and witnessed servants carrying what appeared to be a bundle toward the back alley. His conscience would not let him ignore what he suspected, and he had followed, arriving just as the servants fled. leaving Anna unconscious in the snow. "My God," Aunt Margaret whispered, her face pale. "That poor child. That monster." Mrs. Carmichael nodded gravely. "The Ashworths. I remember my grandmother mentioning that name with distaste, though she would never explain why. Now I understand." Theodore's jaw was clenched, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "What happened next? Did my great-grandfather go to the authorities?" Eleanor found the next passage and read on. Marcus Blackwell had indeed gone to the police, armed with Anna's testimony once she could speak and with the doctor's documentation of her injuries. But the Ashworth family wielded tremendous power. William's father, Cornelius Ashworth, was a major donor to political campaigns and had judges and politicians in his debt. Within days, the case had been quietly dismissed. The official record stated that Anna had been injured in an accident, that she was a disturbed child given to fantasies, that Marcus Blackwell was interfering in family matters that did not concern him. Anna's mother had disappeared, almost certainly paid off or threatened into silence. The servants who had witnessed events were dismissed and scattered, and William Ashworth continued his life of privilege as though nothing had happened, his reputation untarnished, his evil unexposed. Marcus Blackwell was devastated by the failure of justice. Eleanor read, her voice thick with emotion. "He wrote to me that he felt complicit in evil through his inability to stop it. He said that if the law would not protect the innocent, then he must find other ways. He established a fund to support orphanages throughout New England, places where children without family might find safety and care. He did this anonymously because he feared the Ashworth family would retaliate if they knew he continued to work against the indifference that had protected William." Catherine's journal continued for several more pages, documenting Anna's recovery and eventual placement with a family in Vermont, far from Boston and the memories that haunted her. Catherine wrote of her correspondence with Marcus, of their shared commitment to ensuring that what happened to Anna would be remembered, that the truth would not be buried completely beneath the Ashworth family's wealth and influence. The final entry, dated March 1849, just weeks before Catherine's death, was particularly poignant. "I am ill, and I fear I shall not recover. But I take comfort in knowing that this record exists, that somewhere Marcus has also written the truth, and that perhaps, someday, when enough time has passed that justice might finally be possible, these accounts will serve their purpose. Anna writes to me still. She is 19 now, married to a good man, a carpenter in Burlington. She has found peace, though the scars remain. Marcus continues his work, supporting dozens of children in Anna's name. This is how we fight evil when the law fails us. We save those we can, one child at a time, and we remember. Always, we remember." Eleanor closed the journal gently, and for a long moment, no one spoke. The afternoon sun slanted through Mrs. Carmichael's windows, casting golden light across the faded pages, making the old ink seem to glow with the weight of witness it bore. "Your great-grandfather was a hero," Eleanor said finally, looking at Theodore. "He could have done nothing. Most men of his position would have convinced themselves it was not their concern, but he acted, and when the system failed, he found another way to make a difference." Theodore's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "But where is his journal? Catherine mentions that he wrote his own account, but we still do not know where he hid it." Mrs. Carmichael stood slowly, moving to a small secretary desk in the corner of the room. She opened a drawer and withdrew an envelope, yellowed with age. "When I knew you were coming, I searched through all of great-grandmother Catherine's papers. I found this tucked in the back of her Bible. Perhaps it will help." The envelope was addressed in Catherine's hand, "For whoever seeks the truth about Marcus Blackwell." Inside was a single sheet of paper, a letter dated May 1849. Eleanor read it aloud, her voice soft but clear. "If you are reading this, then you have found my journal and learned what Marcus and I witnessed. You should know that Marcus placed his own more detailed account in a place of great significance to him, a place connected to the work we both held sacred. He told me that his journal rests in the foundation of hope, where children who have no one else might find shelter. He established many such places, but one was special to him above all others, the orphanage in Salem where Anna first found safety. He contributed funds to expand the building in 1845, and he told me that within those new walls, the truth was sealed. He said that someday, when the building was torn down or renovated, his journal would be found by those meant to find it. Until then, it rests in the cornerstone, beneath the inscription that reads, "Let mercy be our foundation and justice our roof." Marcus chose those words himself. I pray that whoever discovers his account will use it wisely, that the truth he preserved will finally serve its purpose. Theodore was already standing, energy coursing through him despite his injured leg. The Salem orphanage. Is it still standing? Mrs. Carmichael shook her head. I believe it was renovated about 10 years ago, expanded into a larger facility. If Marcus's journal was in the cornerstone, it would have been discovered then. Eleanor's mind was racing. Unless the construction workers did not recognize its significance, an old journal found in a wall might have been set aside, given to the orphanage administrators, or even sent to a historical society for preservation. The Massachusetts Historical Society, Theodore said, understanding dawning. Where we first met. If someone found the journal during renovation and thought it had historical value, they would have donated it there. Aunt Margaret, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. It is late afternoon now. We should return to Boston tonight. Tomorrow morning you can search the Society's acquisition records from 10 years ago. The train journey back to Boston felt interminable despite taking the same few hours as the morning trip. Eleanor and Theodore sat close together, discussing possibilities, planning their search strategy. But underneath the scholarly conversation ran a current of something deeper. They had shared an emotional experience, uncovering a story of courage and compassion that had moved them both profoundly. The growing connection between them, already present, had been strengthened by this shared purpose. As darkness fell and the train carried them northward through the autumn night, Theodore turned to Eleanor with an intensity that made her breath catch. Miss Ashford, Eleanor, I must tell you something. The use of her given name sent warmth through her. Yes? When I found my great-grandfather's letter and began this search, I thought I was looking for answers about my family's past. But finding you, working with you these past days, I have discovered something I was not seeking. He paused, seeming to gather courage. I have discovered that scholarship is far more meaningful when shared with someone who understands its importance. And I have discovered that I very much wish to continue this partnership, not just until we find the journal, but beyond. Eleanor felt her heart beating rapidly. I would like that as well. Their hands found each other in the dim light of the train compartment, and though Aunt Margaret dozed across from them, Eleanor felt the significance of this moment, this quiet declaration of feelings that were growing into something neither of them had anticipated but both welcomed. Tomorrow, Theodore said softly, we will find my great-grandfather's journal. And then, if you will permit me, I should like to call on you properly, not just as a research colleague, but as a man who wishes to know you better, to spend time in your company, to see where this connection between us might lead. I would like that very much, Eleanor whispered, and in the darkness of the moving train, with the lights of small towns flickering past the windows like fallen stars, she allowed herself to imagine a future that held more than just historical research, that held the possibility of love. They reached Boston late that evening, and Theodore saw both women safely home before departing with plans to meet at the Historical Society first thing in the morning. Eleanor lay awake long into the night, thinking about Anna's story, about Marcus Blackwell's courageous compassion, about the way Theodore's hand had felt in hers, warm and strong and right. The next morning dawned gray and misty, typical November weather for Boston. Eleanor dressed with particular care, choosing a tailored suit of deep blue that she knew flattered her, pinning her hair in a style that was both proper and becoming. She told herself it was simply professional presentation, but she knew it was more than that. She wanted Theodore to see her as she was seeing him, not just as a colleague, but as someone who mattered. They met at the Historical Society, and together they approached the head archivist, Mr. Pemberton, an elderly gentleman who had worked there for 40 years and seemed to remember every document that had passed through his hands. Acquisitions from about 1887? He mused, stroking his white beard. Yes, we received several items from the renovation of the Salem Children's Home that year, mostly administrative records, nothing of particular historical significance as I recall. But there was one leather-bound volume, quite old, that had been found sealed in a metal box within the cornerstone. We catalogued it and placed it in the vault for preservation, but I do not believe anyone has examined it closely. Eleanor and Theodore exchanged glances of barely contained excitement. Could we see it? Eleanor asked. 20 minutes later, they sat at the same table where they had first met, and Mr. Pemberton placed before them a leather-bound journal, its cover darkened by time, but remarkably well preserved thanks to the metal box that had protected it. The first page bore an inscription in bold, clear handwriting, the true account of Marcus Blackwell, written in the year 1845, for those who will come after and seek justice. With trembling hands, Theodore opened to the first full page and began to read aloud, his voice steady despite the emotion Eleanor could see in his eyes. Marcus Blackwell's account was detailed and unflinching, naming names and providing dates, describing not only what he had witnessed that December night, but also his attempts to seek justice through proper channels, the corruption he had encountered, the threats he had received from the Ashworth family's lawyers. But more than that, the journal revealed Marcus's philosophy, his belief that one person's compassion could create ripples of good that spread far beyond what they might ever know. He wrote of establishing orphanages, of the children who had found homes and hope through his anonymous support, of his correspondence with Catherine Whitmore, and their shared commitment to protecting the vulnerable. The final pages contained something neither Eleanor nor Theodore had expected, a detailed accounting of William Ashworth's continued crimes. Marcus had hired private investigators to document William's ongoing abuse of servants and others in vulnerable positions. He had gathered testimony from victims, medical reports, witness statements, all carefully preserved and dated. He built a case, Eleanor breathed. A complete legal case, everything that would be needed for prosecution. But he never used it, Theodore said, reading the final entry dated 1867, a year before Marcus's death. He writes here that he hoped future generations would find this account when times had changed, when perhaps justice might be possible. William Ashworth died in 1865, but Marcus believed other members of that family had enabled and protected him. He wanted the truth preserved so that the Ashworth name would not continue to wield undeserved influence built on hidden evil. Eleanor sat back, her mind working through implications. The Ashworth family is still prominent in Boston. They sit on charitable boards. They fund hospitals and schools. Their name is on buildings throughout the city, built on a foundation of protected cruelty, Theodore said quietly. What do we do with this information, Eleanor? Do we expose it? The living Ashworths are not responsible for William's crimes, but they benefit from wealth and reputation built partly on the silence that protected him. It was the question Marcus Blackwell had left for them, the moral choice he had preserved for future generations to make. Eleanor looked at Theodore, seeing in his eyes the same conflict she felt. The historian in her believed truth should always be revealed, but the compassionate person in her understood that revelation could harm people who bore no blame for their ancestors' sins. I think, she said slowly, that we honor your great-grandfather's memory by using this information wisely, not vindictively. The Ashworth family should know this history. They should understand that their prominence comes with a debt, an obligation to do good that perhaps they are already fulfilling through their charitable work. But the public humiliation of descendants who had nothing to do with William's crimes serves no purpose except revenge, and that was not what Marcus wanted. Theodore reached across the table and took her hand, oblivious to Mr. Pemberton, who had discreetly withdrawn to give them privacy. You are wise and kind, Eleanor. Yes, that is exactly right. We will contact the current head of the Ashworth family privately, share what we have found, and let them decide how to make amends. Perhaps they will increase their charitable giving. Perhaps they will establish something in Anna's name. The point is not to destroy, but to ensure that the truth serves a purpose of good. They spent the remainder of the day carefully documenting everything they had found, making arrangements to have both Catherine's and Marcus's journals properly archived and preserved. As they worked side by side, Eleanor felt the rightness of their partnership, the way their minds worked in harmony, the way they balanced each other's strengths. The confrontation with the Ashworth family took place 3 weeks later, in the austere library of the Ashworth mansion on Beacon Hill, the very building where Marcus Blackwell had witnessed the beginning of Anna's nightmare 55 years earlier. Eleanor had not wanted to come, feeling that this meeting should be Theodore's alone, but he had insisted that they had uncovered this truth together and should present it together. The current patriarch of the family was Nathaniel Ashworth, a distinguished man of 60 with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to respect and deference. He sat behind a massive oak desk, his expression carefully neutral as Theodore laid out the journals and documents they had discovered. Beside him sat his daughter, Victoria Ashworth, a sharp-eyed woman of 30 who served as the family's legal counsel. Theodore spoke clearly and without embellishment, presenting the facts as Marcus and Catherine had recorded them. Eleanor watched Nathaniel's face carefully, seeing shock give way to horror as the story unfolded, as he learned what his grandfather William had done and how the family had protected him through wealth and influence. When Theodore finished, silence filled the library like a heavy fog. Victoria had gone pale, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. Nathaniel had aged 10 years in the telling, his proud bearing crumbling under the weight of truth. "I had heard stories," Nathaniel said finally, his voice hoarse. "Whispers about my grandfather, rumors that my father always dismissed as lies spread by jealous competitors. But this documentation, these first-hand accounts, there is no denying what he was, what he did." He looked up at Theodore and Eleanor, his eyes reddening. "And you say there was a child, Anna, who survived?" "She did," Eleanor said gently. "According to Catherine Whitmore's final entries, Anna married and found happiness. She would be in her 60s now if she still lives. Your grandfather's evil did not destroy her, though it certainly scarred her." Victoria spoke for the first time, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "What do you intend to do with this information? Publish it? Expose our family?" Theodore shook his head. "That was never our purpose. My great-grandfather, Marcus Blackwell, preserved this truth not for revenge but for justice, for ensuring that evil could not hide forever behind wealth and influence. He hoped that future generations might use this knowledge to do good, to make amends in whatever way possible." "What would you have us do?" Nathaniel asked, and there was genuine humility in the question, the proud man brought low by the sins of his grandfather. Eleanor had discussed this moment with Theodore extensively, planning what they would propose. "We believe the Ashworth family should establish a foundation in Anna's name, dedicated to protecting children from abuse and exploitation, fund orphanages, support legal advocacy for victims, create safe houses, anything that helps prevent what happened to Anna from happening to others. Use your family's wealth and influence, built partially on the silence that protected William, to now break that silence and protect the vulnerable." "And the journals?" Victoria asked. "What happens to them?" "They will be archived at the Massachusetts Historical Society," Theodore said firmly. "The truth will be preserved but not sensationalized. Scholars may access them, but we will not seek publicity or press coverage. How your family chooses to explain the Foundation's purpose is your decision. You may acknowledge the full truth or simply say you wish to honor a victim of injustice. Either way, the important thing is that good comes from this revelation." Nathaniel stood, moving to the window that overlooked the back courtyard. Eleanor realized with a chill that this was likely the same window from which Marcus Blackwell had seen servants carrying Anna's broken body toward the alley. The weight of history pressed down on the room, past and present colliding in this moment of reckoning. "We will do as you suggest," Nathaniel said, not turning from the window. "More than you suggest, in fact. I will liquidate some of my personal holdings to establish an endowment that will fund this foundation in perpetuity. And I will ensure that within our family, this history is taught to every generation, so that the Ashworth name becomes associated not with the evil my grandfather did, but with the good we do in response to it." Victoria nodded, composing herself. "I will handle the legal establishment of the foundation. Mr. Blackwell, Miss Ashford, would you be willing to serve on the advisory board? Your guidance would be invaluable, and it seems fitting that the descendants of Marcus Blackwell should help direct how we make amends for what was done." Theodore looked at Eleanor, a question in his eyes. She nodded slightly, and he turned back to the Ashworths. "We would be honored." The meeting concluded with handshakes and quiet promises. As Theodore and Eleanor departed the mansion, stepping out into the crisp December afternoon, Eleanor felt the satisfaction of completion, the sense that they had honored both Marcus Blackwell's memory and his intention. The truth had been revealed, not to destroy but to heal, not for revenge, but for justice. They walked together through the Boston Common, the bare trees etched against a sky that threatened snow. The paths were nearly empty, most people having retreated indoors against the cold, but Eleanor felt no desire to hurry. She wanted to savor this moment, this peaceful conclusion to their investigation, and this time alone with Theodore. "It is finished," Theodore said, echoing her thoughts. "We found the journals, uncovered the truth, and set in motion something that I believe would make my great-grandfather proud. More than proud. Eleanor said warmly. He wanted future generations to choose justice over silence, compassion over complicity. That is exactly what you did today, what we did together. Theodore stopped walking, turning to face her. They stood beneath a large oak tree, its branches bare but somehow still sheltering, creating a private space in the middle of the public park. His expression was serious but tender, his blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her heart race. Eleanor, these past weeks working with you have been the most meaningful of my life, not just because of what we discovered, though that matters tremendously, but because of who I discovered it with. You are brilliant and compassionate, strong and gentle. Everything I did not know I was searching for until I found you in that archive reading room. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears. Tears of joy at hearing words she had hardly dared hope for. Theodore, I feel the same. You have awakened something in me I thought was buried with my father, a sense of purpose and partnership, of being truly seen and valued for who I am. I know we have known each other only a few weeks, Theodore continued, reaching for her hands. I know that by society's standards this may seem precipitous, but I also know that some connections transcend time, that some people are meant to find each other and should not waste the gift of that finding by moving slowly out of excessive caution. What are you saying? Eleanor asked, though her heart already knew, was already soaring with hope and anticipation. I am saying that I love you, Eleanor Ashford. I am saying that I want to continue not just as research partners but as life partners. I am asking if you would consider becoming my wife, building a future with me where we can pursue truth together, do good together, and yes, love each other with the fullness that I already feel and that I see reflected in your eyes when you look at me. Eleanor's answer came without hesitation, born of absolute certainty. Yes, Theodore. Yes to all of it. I love you too, with a depth that surprises and delights me. Yes, I will marry you. He pulled her close then, propriety forgotten in the joy of the moment, and kissed her with a tenderness that promised a lifetime of such moments, of shared discoveries and shared affections. When they finally drew apart, both were smiling, their faces reflecting a happiness that seemed to make even the gray December day brighter. I should speak with your Aunt Margaret, Theodore said, practical even in his joy. Ask for her blessing and your hand properly. Eleanor laughed, the sound bright and free. She will be delighted. She told me just yesterday that she had never seen me so happy, so alive, as I have been these past weeks. She knew before either of us fully acknowledged it that we were falling in love. They walked on, discussing plans, imagining a future that held not just marriage but continued work together. They would write a paper about Marcus Blackwell's philanthropic legacy. They would work with the foundation being established in Anna's name. They would continue to uncover forgotten stories and bring them into the light. Their partnership would extend beyond marriage into every aspect of their lives, a true meeting of minds and hearts. As they neared Eleanor's home, Theodore spoke again, his tone more serious. There is something else I want to do, something I have been thinking about since we found my great-grandfather's journal. What is that? I want to try to find Anna, if she still lives. I want her to know that the truth about what happened to her has been preserved and honored, that it led to something good. She deserves to know that her suffering was not meaningless, that from it came decades of help for other children and will continue to come help for generations more. Eleanor squeezed his hand. That is a beautiful idea. We will search for her together. If she lives, we will find her. And if she has passed, perhaps we can find her children or grandchildren and share with them the legacy of courage their mother or grandmother left behind. The search for Anna took another month, conducted through correspondence with town clerks and church records in Vermont. They finally located her in a small town outside Burlington, living with her daughter's family. Her name was now Anna Morrison, and she was 64 years old, a widow who spent her days tending her garden and teaching her grandchildren to read. Theodore and Eleanor traveled to Vermont in January of 1898, newly engaged and planning a spring wedding. They found Anna in a modest but comfortable farmhouse, her hair white but her eyes still sharp and clear. When they explained who they were and what they had discovered, tears streamed down her weathered face. Mr. Blackwell never forgot me, she said wonderingly. All these years I thought perhaps I had been just another charity case to him, but he remembered. He preserved the truth. You were never just a charity case, Theodore said gently. You were the reason he spent the rest of his life trying to protect other children. You inspired decades of good, Anna. Your survival, Your courage in speaking the truth, even as a frightened child, that mattered. It still matters. Anna held their hands, this elderly woman who had once been a broken child in the snow, and she smiled through her tears. Then something good came from something evil. That is all any of us can hope for, I suppose, that our sufferings might lead to grace for others. They spent the afternoon with Anna, listening to her stories of the life she had built, the happiness she had found despite the horror of her childhood. She spoke of her late husband with love, of her children and grandchildren with pride, of the garden she tended and the quiet satisfactions of a life well lived. Before they left, she gave Eleanor a small package. "These are seeds from my garden," Anna said. "Plant them in yours when spring comes. Let something beautiful grow from our meeting, just as something beautiful grew from Mr. Blackwell's kindness all those years ago." The journey back to Boston was quiet. Both Theodore and Eleanor moved by what they had witnessed. They had seen the end of the story they had been tracing, had met the child who had become a woman, had witnessed how compassion and courage could redeem even the darkest chapters of history. Spring came to Boston with the usual glory of new growth and warming days. Theodore and Eleanor were married on a perfect April morning in 1898, in a simple ceremony at the church Eleanor's family had attended for generations. Aunt Margaret wept happily, and among the guests were Nathaniel and Victoria Ashworth, who had become unlikely friends through the shared work of the foundation. Anna could not travel for the wedding due to her age, but she sent a letter that Eleanor read aloud at the reception, a letter expressing joy that the grandson of Marcus Blackwell had found love and happiness, that good continued to multiply from the seeds of compassion planted so long ago. Eleanor and Theodore established their home in Theodore's Beacon Hill townhouse, where they converted an entire floor into a shared study and archive. They continued their historical research together, uncovering forgotten stories and bringing them to light, always with an eye toward how the past could inform a more just present. The foundation in Anna's name thrived, funding orphanages and advocacy programs throughout New England and beyond. Each year on December 12th, the anniversary of the night Marcus Blackwell found Anna in the snow, the foundation held a fundraising gala where Theodore and Eleanor spoke about the power of one person's compassion to change the world. On a warm evening in late spring, several months after their wedding, Eleanor and Theodore sat in their garden, watching the sun set over Boston. In the flower beds, Anna's seeds had grown into beautiful climbing roses, their blooms filling the air with fragrance. Eleanor rested her hand on her husband's, feeling the quiet contentment of a life shared with someone who understood her completely. "Do you ever think about how we met?" Theodore asked, his voice soft in the twilight. "How I walked into that reading room and found you surrounded by journals, searching for answers about my great-grandfather, though neither of us knew it then." "I think about it often," Eleanor replied. "How easily we might have missed each other. If you had come on a different day, if I had been researching something else, if any of 1,000 small things had been different." "But they were not different," Theodore said, lifting her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. "We were meant to find each other, Eleanor, just as we were meant to find the truth about Marcus and Anna. Some things are destiny, I think. Some people are meant to cross paths because together they can do what neither could do alone." Eleanor leaned against her husband's shoulder, watching the stars begin to emerge in the darkening sky. She thought about the journey that had brought them here, about journals hidden in cornerstones and truths preserved across decades, about a child saved and a man determined to make suffering mean something, about love found in the midst of historical investigation. "Your great-grandfather was right," she said quietly. The key to understanding did lie in his actions, recorded faithfully by Catherine Whitmore, but the key to everything, to the whole story, was in something even simpler. "What was that?" Theodore asked. "Compassion," Eleanor said. "One person seeing another person suffering and refusing to look away, refusing to accept that nothing could be done. Your great-grandfather saw Anna and acted. Catherine saw the truth and preserved it. You saw injustice even across decades and sought to make it right. And I saw in you a kindred spirit, someone who believed, as I do, that the past matters because it shapes who we become and what we choose to do." Theodore was quiet for a moment, then he spoke with conviction. "And now we get to spend our lives continuing that work, uncovering truths, making sure forgotten stories are remembered, and loving each other through all of it. I cannot imagine a more perfect future." "Nor can I," Eleanor said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. In the years that followed, their life together bore out the promise of that spring evening. They published numerous papers and books, each one bringing light to some forgotten corner of history. They watched the foundation grow and flourish, knowing that Anna's story continued to inspire and protect. They traveled together, researched together, debated and discussed and discovered together. And through it all, their love deepened and strengthened, proved daily in the small acts of partnership and care that make a marriage true. They were blessed with 2 children, a daughter they named Catherine after Catherine Whitmore, and a son they named Marcus after Theodore's great-grandfather. To these children, they taught the lessons they had learned, that truth matters, that compassion changes the world, that one person's choice to act with courage and kindness can echo across generations. The key had indeed been hidden in an old journal, but the truth it unlocked was not just about the past. It was about the present and the future, about the power of love and justice to redeem suffering, about the beautiful things that can grow when people refuse to let evil have the final word. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Theodore and Eleanor returned to the Massachusetts Historical Society, to the very table where they had first met. The reading room was unchanged, still filled with the hushed reverence of those who seek knowledge in old pages. They sat together, holding hands across the mahogany surface, and looked at each other with the deep contentment of 2 people who had built a life of meaning and purpose together.
"If I could go back to that day we met," Theodore said, "and tell that younger version of myself what was about to begin, I do not think he would have believed how blessed he was about to become." "I would have believed it," Eleanor said with a smile. "From the moment you spoke to me, I felt something shift, felt the presence of possibility. You told me the truth first, Theodore, before we ever found the journals or uncovered the secrets. You told me, just by being who you are, that love and partnership and shared purpose were possible, were waiting for me if I was brave enough to reach for them." They left the Historical Society hand in hand, walking out into the bright afternoon of 1923, a couple grown older but no less devoted to each other and to the work they had built together. Behind them in the archives, Marcus Blackwell's journal rested in its climate-controlled vault, its pages a testament to the power of truth and compassion. And ahead of them stretched whatever years remained, to be filled with more research, more love, more moments of grace born from the choice to seek truth and act with kindness. The key had been hidden in an old journal, but Theodore's presence had told Eleanor the deepest truth first, that love, when combined with shared purpose and mutual respect, was the greatest discovery of all, and that truth, unlike the secrets of the past, would never need to be hidden or preserved in cornerstones. It would live in them, in their children, in everyone whose life they touched, echoing forward into a future made brighter by the choice to love truly and act justly, just as Marcus Blackwell had done so many years before.